The Duke Ashcombe had not ridden since the fall at Fen Brook, and on the morning his wife saddled 2 horses and stood waiting at the paddock gate. The frost had not yet come, but everyone at Alderley Hall could feel it deciding whether to. Eleanor had been up since before the kitchen fires were lit, and she had done the saddling herself, both animals, because she trusted her own hands over any groom's when the thing being fastened mattered this much. Juniper stood easy under the bit, chestnut coat catching the grey light like something warmed from inside. Beside her, Korak stood black and still and enormous. The horse Julian had not touched in a year, and the horse did not fidget, which Eleanor had come to understand as its own kind of grief. A horse that has been left alone long enough stops expecting anyone to come back for it. She had plaited a thin cord of horsehair into a ring on the morning of her wedding, made from the first shedding of Korax's foal tail, taught to her by her father, before her father had been anything to anyone but a man who bred and broke and sold horses for a living. And she wore that ring now, on a cord beneath her collar, the only jewel she had ever worn that she had not been given by someone trying to prove something. She did not know, this particular morning, whether he wore it still. The stable yard smelled of hay going sweet with damp, and of the leather she had dressed the night before, oil and horse, and the cold mineral smell that meant frost was close enough to plan for. And somewhere above her, the copper horse and rider on the old stable cupola turned a slow quarter turn, in a wind she could not feel at ground level. Tam Rigg came out with 2 buckets and set them down without being asked, the way a man does a job he has done for 20 years and does not need thanking for. He looked at the 2 saddled horses, and he looked at Eleanor, and he said nothing at all for the length of time it took him to scratch Juniper once behind the ear. Then he said, "You want the black to go quiet today, your grace. He's been fed light, and he knows what a gate means better than most Christians do." Eleanor did not answer that directly. She said, "Has he come down yet?" Tam did not need to ask who she meant. He come as far as his window, he told her, and he stood there a good while, looking down at what you'd done, and then he went off again, and I couldn't tell you which way he's leaning, because a man like the Duke keeps his face the way you'd keep a strong box, and I've never yet met the key that opens one of them by asking twice. It was the anniversary week, near enough. The hunt that had once marked their wedding morning now marked only the day the ground at Fen Brook had given way under Korax's forelegs and taken Julian's leg and his brother's life in the same half-second. And for a year, the hall had observed that week the way a house observes a room it keeps locked, walking past it, never quite forgetting it was there. Eleanor had married a man who laughed easily and rode recklessly, and loved his younger brother with an uncomplicated fierceness she had envied a little, because her own family had been small and quiet, and full of horses rather than people, and she had thought, in the giddy week of her wedding, that she had married into noise and warmth after a childhood of neither. She had not understood, not truly, how much of that noise and warmth had belonged to Edmund specifically, and how completely a house could go silent once one voice was taken out of it. Julian had not ridden since. He had not, in the year since, gone further from the house than the orangery and the estate office, walking with a cane he despised and a limp he pretended, badly, not to have. He managed correspondence. He signed what his cousin Gerald put in front of him. He had stopped somewhere in that year, being a man anyone expected anything more of, and Eleanor had watched it happen the way you watch a fire burn low in a room you are afraid to leave. because leaving might be the thing that lets it go out entirely. She had decided 3 nights ago, lying awake beside a husband who slept like a man guarding something, that she would not spend another autumn waiting for him to decide grief was finished with him. Grief, her father used to say, is not a fever that breaks on its own. It is more like a green colt. Left to itself in a dark stall, it does not grow calmer. It grows more afraid of the light. She had not told Tam what she meant to do beyond saddling the horses. She had not told the Dowager Duchess, who would have called it presumption, nor Gerald, who managed rather more of the estate than a cousin by right ought to, and who would have called it, in that mild, reasonable voice of his, unwise. She had told no one but herself, and the horse, whose ears turned toward the house the moment the side door opened, before Eleanor herself had heard anything at all. Julian came out into the yard dressed for riding. Not dressed to ride, she understood after a moment, only dressed the way a man dresses when he is not yet certain which of 2 things he intends to do. Coat and boots and gloves, no crop. His cane left behind against all sense, as though leaving it inside were itself an answer he had not fully committed to giving. He stopped a full 10 feet from the gate, and looked at the 2 horses the way another man might look at 2 loaded pistols, laid out for a duel he had not agreed to fight. Eleanor did not go to him. She had learned that much in a year of watching him flinch from kindness offered too quickly, the way a spooked animal will bolt from the very hand meant to steady it. She stood at the gate with the reins of both horses looped once over her wrist, and she said nothing, and she let the silence do the asking for her, the same silence she had used 100 times on a nervous yearling who needed to come to the halter on its own legs, or not at all. Julian's hand went, without his seeming to notice it, to the base of his throat, where something used to hang against his skin, and where now there was only the plain cloth of his shirt. "Eleanor," he said. Just that, her name, the way a man tests a floorboard before putting his full weight on it. Then, after a silence long enough that a lesser woman might have filled it, he said, "You've saddled Corax." She said, "I have." He looked at the horse a long moment, and the horse looked back at him with an animal's whole, uncomplicated patience. And something crossed Julian's face that was not quite pain, and not quite hope, and was perhaps, Eleanor thought, watching him with the same close, unhurried attention she gave any creature deciding whether to trust her, both of those things wearing each other's coat. He did not come through the gate. He did not go back inside either. He stood exactly where he was, one hand at his throat, and the other white-knuckled on nothing at all, and behind him, up on the stable roof, the copper rider on his copper horse turned another slow quarter turn, as if weighing which way the day still meant to go. He did not come through the gate that morning, and Eleanor did not ask him to. She led both horses back to their stalls herself, unsaddled Corax with the particular gentleness she reserved for animals who had been disappointed before, and said nothing more to Julian than that his eggs would go cold if he stood in the yard much longer thinking about them instead of eating them. It was the sort of small, ordinary cruelty of tone that a marriage earns the right to after enough years, the tone that says, "I see exactly what you are doing, and I will not make it easier for you by pretending I don't." And Julian, to her private and carefully hidden relief, almost smiled. Almost. The smile arrived the way weather arrives on the far hills, visible a long way off, taking its time to reach where you actually stood. And by the time it should have reached his eyes, it had already spent itself somewhere around his mouth. Alderley Hall, in the week before the anniversary hunt, was full of the particular business that great houses manufacture for themselves when they would rather not sit still with their own thoughts. Linen was aired that had been aired a fortnight before. The Dowager Duchess, Julian's mother, held court in the small drawing-room over correspondence that required no answering, and reviewed the household accounts with Gerald Ashcombe at her elbow, and looked up at Eleanor whenever she came through the door with an expression that had softened in a year of marriage, from open disapproval to something more like wary tolerance. The look a farmer gives whether he has decided not to trust yet, but no longer actively curses. Lady Augusta had wanted, everyone in the county understood, a bride for her elder son who came with land adjoining Alderley's, or failing that, a name old enough to need no explaining. She had got, instead, a horse breeder's daughter from 3 counties off, clever with figures and blunter of speech than any duchess had strictly needed to be in the last 200 years. And she had spent the first months of the marriage waiting, not quite patiently, for Eleanor to reveal whatever flaw had been concealed beneath the courtship. Gerald managed what Julian no longer managed. He had done so since the week of the accident, stepping into the gap the way water finds a gap, without announcement, without apparent ambition, simply because someone had to sign the tenant leases and answer the timber merchant's letters, and Julian, that first winter, had not been able to hold a pen steady enough to do either. He was an easy man to like. He remembered the names of every steward's child in the parish. He laughed at his own expense before anyone else could, and his courtesy arrived a half-breath before his meaning did, like a servant sent ahead to make sure the room was ready before the master walked in. Eleanor had liked him for the better part of a year. She found him in the estate office that afternoon, going over the timber accounts with the ink still wet, and she asked him, in the mild tone she had learned did more work than any sharp one, whether the hall could truly afford the anniversary hunt this year, given what she understood of the harvest. Gerald set down his pen and gave her the whole warmth of his attention, which was, she had noticed before, its own kind of instrument, tuned precisely to whoever stood in front of him. "Your Grace worries like a woman who was taught to worry properly," he said, "and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to pay. We can afford it. We can afford it because I have arranged to let the East Coppice go to Enderby's people for the winter cutting, which will more than cover it, and because your husband, forgive me for saying it plainly, needs something on the calendar to walk toward rather than nothing at all." Eleanor said that the East Coppice had not, to her recollection, been discussed with Julian. Gerald's smile did not move, which was itself a kind of movement. "Julian signs what I put in front of him, Your Grace," he said, "and I have never yet put anything in front of him that was not in his interest, and I would ask you not to trouble him with coppice figures this week of all weeks." She let it go. She told herself, walking back through the long gallery with its portraits of Ashcombes, who had never once, as far as she could tell from their painted faces, doubted their own right to anything, that a good land agent, managing an incapacitated duke's affairs, was not in itself a wound, and that her unease was grief looking for somewhere to stand. That evening she found Julian in Edmund's old room, which no one had cleared and no one had mentioned clearing, sitting in the window seat with his bad leg stretched before him, and a riding crop across his knees that he was not holding so much as guarding. He did not look up when she came in. Eleanor did not ask permission to stay. She sat on the floor beside the window seat, her back against the shutter, the way she had sat beside frightened animals 100 times before learning it worked equally well on frightened men. And after a long while, Julian said, without any preamble at all, that Edmund had asked him to wait. That morning, at the wall, he said the ground looked soft to him and he wanted to walk the line first, and I told him there wasn't time, that the whole field was waiting on us, that a duke doesn't keep his own wedding hunt waiting for a puddle. Those were my words, a puddle. Eleanor did not feel the silence that followed. She let it sit there, the way she had learned to let silence sit, and after a while Julian said, quieter, I have not told my mother that. I have not told Gerald. I have not, until this moment, told you the words I actually used, because saying the words makes them true in a way the general shape of the thing never quite managed to. She reached up, not to take his hand, only to rest her own on the sill near it, close enough that he could close the distance if he chose. He did not yet. But he did not move away either, and outside the window the copper horse on the stable roof turned once more, against a sky gone the color of a bruise healing. And somewhere below in the yard, a stable door banged twice in the rising wind, the second time harder than the first, as though something down there had decided, on its own account, that the quiet part of the year was ending. The anniversary hunt was 3 weeks off by the time Gerald Ashcombe stood at the head of the long table and announced, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything, that he had taken it upon himself to secure a buyer for the far pasture at Cresswell, 40 acres that had belonged to the estate since before there had been a duke to belong to it, and that the sale would clear the debt on the west wing roof entirely. He said it the way a man announces good weather. He said it in front of the Dowager Duchess and Sir Robert Fulks, who had ridden over for dinner as he did most weeks since his own estate marched with Alderleys and his own company, since his mother's death, ran mostly to dogs and account books. And in front of Julian, who set down his fork very carefully and said nothing at all for the length of 3 full breaths. Eleanor watched him not say anything and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from watching a person you love manage pain in company, that the silence cost him considerably more than any objection would have. It was Sir Robert who broke it, not Julian, leaning back in his chair with the easy irreverence of a man who has never once had to fight for his own place at a table. 40 acres at Cresswell, he said. That's the good grazing, isn't it, Ashcombe? The bottomland your father always swore he'd be buried under before he'd sell it. Gerald's smile did not so much as flicker. Circumstances change, Sir Robert, he said, and those of us charged with the Duke's affairs while he recovers his strength must sometimes make the harder choice rather than the sentimental one. Julian said, and this was the first thing he had said since the announcement, that he did not recall being asked. The table went very still. Gerald's face did the thing Eleanor had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to watch for. A smile that arrived a half-second before the eyes agreed to join it, and departed a half-second after the mouth had already moved on. "Forgive me, cousin," he said. "I understood from our last conversation that you'd left the particulars to my judgment, as you have for the better part of a year now, and I would never presume beyond that trust without cause." It was, Eleanor thought, a perfectly built sentence. The kind that could not be argued with directly, because it did not accuse Julian of anything except having once, reasonably, delegated a burden he could not, at the time, carry. The Dowager Duchess, watching the exchange with the flat, professional attention of a woman who had buried a husband and outlived 2 seasons of court gossip, said only that land could always be bought back, and a roof could not go on leaking indefinitely, which settled nothing, and ended the topic all the same, because that was the particular authority age had given her, the luxury of setting a whole conversation down whole with a single plain sentence. Later, in the quiet of their own rooms, Julian told Eleanor that he did not think Gerald meant any harm by it. "He has managed everything I couldn't face this year," he said, "and a man who does that for you earns the benefit of a doubt or two." Eleanor did not disagree aloud, not yet, though she found herself thinking of her father again, of the year a horse-trader named Ludlow had managed her father's stock, while a broken collarbone kept him from the yard, and how her father had said afterward, once he could walk again, that the man had done everything asked of him and several things never asked at all, and that this second category was the one worth watching. "It isn't the fall that ruins the horse," her father used to say, turning a colt loose in the round pen to test what a bad handler had left behind in it. "It's what you decide the fall meant." She said some version of this to Julian that night, not as accusation, only as the kind of thing said aloud between 2 people lying in the dark, with their shoulders not quite touching. He was quiet a long while. Then he said, "And you think I've decided wrong?" She said she thought he had stopped deciding at all, and let someone else decide for him, which was not the same fault, but wore its coat some days. He did not answer that, but later, near morning, she felt him shift toward her in his sleep, the way Korax used to lean his whole weight, unthinking, against the one person in a crowded yard who had never once flinched from him, and she lay still and let him, and did not mention it in the morning, because some kinds of trust are easier given than acknowledged. 3 days after the dinner, Julian agreed, over her quiet objection, to let Gerald proceed with the Cresswell sale, on the grounds that the roof genuinely could not wait another winter, and Eleanor, watching him sign the paper with a hand that still was not entirely steady, understood that she had just watched her husband make a bargain he did not yet know he would come to regret, and that she had let him make it, because pressing harder that particular week would have cost more than the 40 acres were worth. Outside, the weather had turned close and airless, the kind of dry heat that arrives out of season and sits over a house like a held breath, and the stable weather vane hung motionless for 3 full days, as if even the wind had decided to wait and see which way this was going to go before committing itself to a direction. The discrepancy, when Eleanor found it, was £9 4 shillings, which was too small a sum for a house the size of Alderley to notice, and too precise a sum for her not to. She had gone through the stable ledgers herself, a habit her father had drilled into her before he had ever taught her to sit a trot, because a man who cannot read his own account book, he used to say, is trusting every stranger who can to be honest for him. And she had gone through them not out of suspicion, but out of the particular restlessness that comes from being kept, gently and thoroughly, out of every conversation that mattered. £9 4 shillings, paid the week after the accident at Fenbrook, to one J. Pruitt, under the heading Removal Expenses, in Gerald's own hand, and beneath it, in the same hand, a second entry from the same week, girth leather, mislaid, 4 shillings 6 pence, which struck her as an odd thing to record at all, since mislaid leather is not usually an expense a house pays out for. It is simply leather that turns up again in a different drawer. She sat with the ledger a long while in the estate office, the afternoon light going gold and then gray across the page, and she thought about the name, Pruitt. She asked Tam that evening, over the business of dressing a strained fetlock on one of the carriage horses, whether he remembered a groom by that name, and Tam did not look up from his work for a long moment, which told her something before he said a single word. Josiah Pruitt, he said eventually. Kept the tack room the year of the accident.
Left sudden, not a fortnight after, no notice given, no character asked for either, which is not how a man leaves a good place if he means to work again anywhere decent. I always thought it queer he went so quick and so quiet, a man that fond of his position. He straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag gone black with liniment, and said the thing Eleanor had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to say aloud. A saddle doesn't slip its girth by accident twice in the same family, in the same year, your grace. Not on a horse tacked up by a man who'd done nothing else his whole life. First time's misfortune. Second time somebody wants you to call it misfortune again. Eleanor asked him where a man like Pruitt might have gone. Tam considered this the way he considered most things, slowly, with the air of a man turning a stone over to see what lived underneath it. He'd have gone where there's horses and no one asking questions, he said. Hostlers' work most like, some coaching in on a main road, somewhere a man can disappear into a trade he knows without anybody troubling over his last place. I could ask about, quiet-like, wouldn't take more than a letter or two to the right sort of men. She told him to do it quietly, and to tell no one else, not even, she said, and here she hesitated, not even his grace, not yet, not until we know what we're telling him. Tam did not ask why. He had known her long enough, since she was small enough to be lifted onto a pony by the scruff of her coat, to understand that when Eleanor Hartley, now Eleanor Ashcombe, asked for quiet, it was because she had already decided something was worth the risk of being wrong about. And Tam's whole philosophy of service, developed over 40 years of horses and the people who owned them, held that a groom's job was to saddle what he was told to saddle, and hold his tongue about the rest until asked. He held it 4 days. On the 5th, he told her he had word of a Josiah Pruitt keeping horses at a coaching inn 2 counties off, on the London road, a place called The Feathers at Sedgemoor, and that the man answering to that name had been there the better part of a year, quiet, kept to himself, drank less than most men in his trade, and jumped, according to the innkeeper's boy, at any cart that came in too fast. Eleanor did not sleep well that night. She lay beside Julian, who slept the deep, unguarded sleep of a man who has finally, after a bad stretch, had one good day. And she thought about the shape of what she now suspected, turning it the way she'd turn a strange horse loose in the round pen, watching for what it would do when nothing was asked of it. If the girth had been cut or weakened, or simply not properly checked by a man paid 4 shillings 6 pence extra to make certain it was not, then Julian's recklessness, the puddle, the words he had used to Edmund and had carried like a stone in his mouth for a year, had perhaps never been the thing that mattered at all. And if that were true, then someone had wanted Julian broken, in body if not entirely in spirit, on the very morning that ought to have been the beginning of something, and had been managing the wreckage of that morning, competently, kindly, unassailably, ever since. She did not say any of this to Julian in the morning. She said only that she meant to ride over to Sir Robert's on some business of her own, and would he mind the house a day without her? And Julian, who had begun in the last week to sit in the estate office of a morning without Gerald hovering at his elbow, said he thought he could manage that. And there was something almost dry in the way he said it, a small return of the man who used to make her laugh across a crowded dinner table by saying the exact wrong thing in the exact right tone. Outside, for the first time in 9 days, the wind had picked up, and the copper rider on the stable roof swung hard about to face due east, toward the London road, as if it too had somewhere it suddenly needed to be.
Sir Robert Folkes received the request to ride to Sedgemoor with the particular good humour of a man who has been waiting a year for someone at Alderley to ask him for something more interesting than the loan of a hunting dog. And he did not ask Eleanor why, which she appreciated more than she said aloud. He had courted her 3 years before, in the mild, unhurried way of a man who assumed there would always be time, and had lost her to Julian's quicker, louder attention, without ever once behaving as though he'd been wronged by it, which was, she thought, the truest measure of the man. "We'll go as far as Sedgemoor and back inside 2 days if the roads hold," he told her, "and I'll ask the questions, since a stranger asking after a runaway groom draws less notice than a duchess does. And you can sit in the carriage looking mysterious, which I understand you do very well. Josiah Pruitt, when they found him mucking out a loose box at the Feathers, with his sleeves rolled and his face gone the particular grey of a man who has not slept easily in a year, did not run, though his whole body flinched the way a whipped dog's does at a raised hand, before he understood the hand held nothing. He knew Eleanor's face from her wedding, he said. He'd been in the yard that very morning tacking up half the field, and he set down his fork and did not pick it up again the whole time they talked. I've thought on it every day since, he said, not asked to think on it. Can't stop. He told them, haltingly, in the particular unbroken confession the profile of a guilty conscience always seems to want to give, once it is finally offered the floor, that Mr. Ashcombe, meaning Gerald, had come to him the evening before the wedding hunt and told him that his Grace's girth wanted replacing, the leather gone soft at the buckle holes, and had given him a new strap to fit, 4 shillings 6pence out of his own pocket for the trouble. A kindness, he'd thought it at the time, a cousin looking out for a duke's safety. He had not thought to examine the strap closely. He had not thought, God forgive him, to wonder why a man who managed timber sales and tenant leases would trouble himself with a groom's proper business, would bring the leather himself rather than sending for it through the tack-room accounts, as any decent gentleman would. It was only after, he said, after the fall, after young Mr. Edmund was carried back across 3 men's shoulders and the whole house gone to weeping, that he'd found the old girth, the true one, still coiled in a corner of the tack-room, where he'd set it aside to be re-oiled, sound as the day it was made, not a weak stitch in it, and understood, slowly, sickly, exactly what he had been made an instrument of. Gerald had paid him £9 4 shillings a week later, called it kindness for long and faithful service, and told him gently, in that same warm, reasonable voice, that a man in his position might find the atmosphere at Alderley grown difficult after such a tragedy,
and that a fresh start elsewhere, generously funded, might suit him better than staying to be reminded of it daily. He had taken the money because he was afraid, and because Gerald had made the leaving sound like mercy rather than exile. And he had told no one, not the vicar, not his own brother, because who would believe a groom's word over a gentleman's, and because saying it aloud would make it a thing that had truly happened, rather than a thing he could, on his worst nights, almost convince himself he had imagined. He had kept the old girth. He did not know why, except that a thing so plainly innocent had felt, obscurely, like evidence of something, though evidence of what he could not have said until this very moment, sitting in a stranger's loose box with a duchess and a baronet, listening to him with faces gone very still. It was in his box under the hay-net, he said, wrapped in oilcloth, and he would swear on his mother's grave to every word he'd just told them, if it came to swearing.
Sir Robert, when they had the girth wrapped and stowed, and Pruitt persuaded, with some difficulty and the promise of Alderley's protection, to come with them, said only, on the road back, that he had always thought Gerald a touch too smooth to be entirely trusted, the way you'd distrust a horse that never once put a foot wrong in the yard, and then bolted at the first open gate, and that he was sorrier than he could easily say to be right about it. Eleanor rode the last miles with the oilcloth bundle on her lap, like something alive, and thought of Julian sitting in the estate office that very hour, believing still, as he had believed for a year, that his own recklessness had killed his brother. And she understood that she was carrying in her two hands the exact thing that would set that belief down forever, and also, unavoidably, the exact thing that would tell him a man he had trusted with his whole broken life for 12 months had engineered the wreck of it on purpose. She had meant to tell Julian alone, in their own rooms, with the door shut and no one else within hearing, and she had planned, on the long ride back from Sedgemoor, the careful order in which she would say it, the girth first, then Pruitt's account, then Gerald's name last of all, so that the shape of the thing would be plain before the accusation landed. She did not get the chance. Gerald had noticed, in the 2 days of her absence, that Tam Rigg had been asking quiet questions of stable hands 2 counties off, because a man who manages an estate's every letter and every account learns, sooner or later, when someone else has begun writing letters of their own. And he was waiting in the front hall when the carriage came up the drive at dusk, standing with the particular stillness of a man who already knows the shape of the conversation he is about to have, and has decided how he means to survive it. He saw Josiah Pruitt climb down from the carriage before Eleanor did, and something moved across his face, there and gone, faster than she had ever seen him allow anything to move across it before. "Cousin," he said to her, pleasantly, as though nothing at all had shifted, "you've brought back a stray." Julian came out onto the front steps at the sound of the wheels, moving faster than his leg liked, and Eleanor saw him take in the tableau, Pruitt grey-faced and flinching in the drive, Gerald very still by the door, herself with an oilcloth bundle held against her chest, like something she meant to protect with her body if it came to that. And she understood there was no way now to give him the careful, ordered version she had planned on the road. "Julian," she said, "this is Josiah Pruitt. He kept your tack the year of the accident." Gerald's laugh arrived a half-second too quickly to be real, the particular practiced ease of a man filling a silence before it could fill itself with something worse. "Your Grace doesn't need old stable gossip dredged up the week of the anniversary hunt," he said, addressing Julian directly now, his voice pitched low and steady and reasonable. the voice of a man managing a nervous animal, and it struck Eleanor, hearing it, that she had heard that exact tone from Gerald 100 times over the past year, and had mistaken it for kindness rather than technique. Julian did not look at Gerald. He looked at Pruitt, and something in the groom's face made him go very still himself, the stillness of a man standing at the top of a stair in the dark, feeling for a step that is not where memory says it should be. He said Pruitt's name once, quietly, not a question so much as a man testing whether the name still meant what he thought it meant. Pruitt could not meet his eyes. He said, "Your Grace, I'm sorrier than living can hold." And then, because a confession once begun does not know how to stop itself, he told it all again. The girth, the 4 shillings 6pence, the 9 pounds paid to make him disappear quietly, standing in the cooling dusk of the drive with his cap twisted in both hands. And Julian listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, his face gone the particular gray-white of a man hearing, at last, the sentence that reorders every other sentence spoken to him in the last year. When Pruitt finished, the silence that followed was long enough that Eleanor heard, quite clearly, a blackbird, somewhere in the yew hedge, finishing its evening song, as though nothing at all had happened. Julian turned finally to Gerald. "Is it true?" he said. "Only that." Gerald's face did the thing it had always done, the smile arriving before the eyes agreed to it. But this time it did not quite hold its shape all the way through, and something underneath it showed for half a heartbeat. Not guilt exactly, Eleanor thought later, but the particular blank fear of a man watching a structure he has spent years building come apart in a wind he had not accounted for. "Julian," he said, and his voice had lost its usual warm, unhurried register, gone thinner, faster. "I have managed this estate for a year, while you could not lift a pen. I have kept this house from ruin twice over, and you would take the word of a groom I paid handsomely to leave quietly, over the word of your own blood." It was not, Eleanor noted even then, a denial. Julian seemed to notice the same thing. He said, very quietly, "That isn't an answer, Gerald." And Gerald, perhaps hearing for the first time in a year that the voice asking him a question was not the broken voice he had grown accustomed to managing, took one step backward, toward the door, toward the house, toward, Eleanor understood with sudden cold clarity, whatever papers in the estate office he meant to have burning before morning. He did not run, not yet. He said, with something almost like dignity, that they would discuss this like reasonable men once the household had gone to bed, and that airing a groom's fancies in the drive before the servants was beneath all of them. And Julian, who a week before would very likely have agreed to exactly that, said no, we will discuss it now, in front of my mother, in front of the house. And Eleanor watched her husband, for the first time in a year, stand entirely on his own 2 feet, cane forgotten against the door frame where he had left it. And she thought, with an ache too large to examine just then, that grief truly had been a green colt after all, and that someone had finally opened the stall door. The refusal came from the Dowager Duchess first, before it came from Eleanor, which surprised no one more than Eleanor herself. Lady Augusta had been sent for, and had come down in her dressing gown, with her hair not yet put up for the night, and had listened to the whole account a second time, Pruitt's confession, the girth wrapped still in its oilcloth, and laid now on the hall table, like something taken off a battlefield.
Gerald's increasingly careful silences, with the flat, unhurried attention of a woman who had spent 40 years learning to read a room before the room had finished deciding what it meant to say. When Gerald, recovering some of his composure, suggested that the matter might be managed quietly, that Pruitt might be paid a further sum for his continued silence and his continued absence, that a scandal touching the family name so soon before the anniversary hunt would serve no one, least of all Julian, who had suffered enough without the county whispering that his own cousin had arranged his ruin. It was Lady Augusta who cut him off, not Eleanor, with a single flat sentence delivered the way she delivered everything, each word set down whole and separate. "I have buried a husband, Gerald," she said, "and I did not do it by teaching my sons that a comfortable lie is worth more than an uncomfortable truth. And I will not begin the practice now on your account." Eleanor, watching her, understood that this was, in its way, an apology as much as a judgment, the closest Lady Augusta had ever come, or perhaps would ever come, to admitting that she had spent a year trusting the wrong Ashcombe with her elder son's ruin, and calling it good management. Eleanor said her own piece after that, quieter, because the Dowager Duchess had already claimed the room's attention and did not need sharing it. "A lie kept kindly," she said, "is still a lie. And I will not build whatever is left of this house on one, however comfortable it might feel to lay the first stone." It was Julian who moved next, and moved wrong, though it took Eleanor some days to understand it as anything other than cruelty. He turned to her, in front of his mother, in front of Gerald, in front of Pruitt still standing wretched by the door, and said that she should go to her father's people for a while, until the anniversary hunt and whatever came after it were finished. That there would be talk, ugly talk, lawyers perhaps, and he would not have her standing in the middle of it. He meant it, she understood later, as the one clean thing he could still offer her. The same instinct that makes a wounded animal drag itself away from the herd rather than risk infecting the rest with whatever is killing it. But she heard it, standing in that hall with Pruitt's confession still ringing in the air, and the copper weather vane creaking somewhere above them in a wind that had begun, finally, to smell of coming rain, as something closer to being sent away. She did not argue with him in front of the household. She went up to their rooms and packed a single case herself, refusing the maid's help, and Julian did not come up to stop her, because he believed, with the particular stubborn wrongness of a man convinced his own protection is a gift, that letting her go was the last decent thing left within his power to do. She left before first light, taking Juniper rather than the carriage, because she found she could not sit still inside a box on wheels with everything unsettled. And Tam saw her off at the gate without a word of argument, only a long look, and the observation, delivered to the horse rather than to her, that some folk mistake a closed gate for a locked one, when it was never anything but shut. She rode to her father's old farm, 3 counties off, into a wind that had turned, overnight, into something with real weight behind it. And she did not look back at the hall, though she thought, more than once on that ride, of the copper rider on the stable roof, and wondered which way it was turning now that she could no longer see it. The storm broke over Alderley the night before Eleanor left, and did not fully clear for 2 days, and it was into the washed, pale light of the 3rd morning, the air scoured clean the way weather sometimes scours a house, after it has finally, been allowed to say the worst thing in it out loud. That the anniversary hunt breakfast was held because Lady Augusta had decreed, over Gerald's objection, that it would go forward exactly as planned, in exactly the same room, with exactly the same guests invited, since a family that changes its habits the moment the truth becomes inconvenient is a family already halfway to agreeing the truth was wrong to arrive at all. Sir Robert brought Pruitt himself in his own carriage, and stood beside the man in the breakfast room, the way a second stands beside a duellist. And it was Sir Robert, not Julian, who first laid the old girth and the new one side by side on the long table in front of the assembled guests. The county families who had come expecting hunt talk and found instead a courtroom laid with silver and cold ham. "Read it aloud," he said, not to Pruitt but to Gerald, nodding at the ledger page Eleanor had brought back from the estate office and set beside the leather, so that everyone in this room hears the same words at the same moment, and no one has to take it afterward on anyone else's account of what was said. Gerald did not read it. He stood very straight at the head of the table, and for a long moment his composure held so completely that Eleanor almost believed, watching him, that he might simply talk his way clean through it, as he had talked his way through every difficult year since the accident, courtesy arriving a half-breath ahead of meaning, warmth deployed like a tool because it had always, until now, been sufficient. It was Julian who read it instead, standing at the far end of the table with his cane left, again, forgotten against the wall, his voice steady in a way it had not been steady in a year, reading the ledger entry and then Pruitt's written account, taken down and signed 2 nights before in the presence of the county magistrate, in full, without once raising it, because he had learned, perhaps from watching his mother his whole life, that the quietest voice in a room is the one that makes everyone else stop breathing to hear it. When he finished, he looked at Gerald and asked him, for the second time, whether it was true, and this time Gerald did not answer with reasonable words at all. He moved instead, a single involuntary lunge across the table toward the ledger page, as though he might yet snatch it back into some private darkness where it could be managed and reasoned with and made to mean something other than what it plainly meant. And Sir Robert's hand came down on his wrist before he had covered half the distance, and the whole room saw it, the reaching, the failure, the truth of a year laid bare in one ungoverned movement that no amount of afterward courtesy could unsay. Gerald stood very still once Sir Robert released him, and something in his face gave way at last. Not into weeping, he was not a man built for weeping, but into a kind of tiredness Eleanor had never once seen him allow anyone to witness. "I never meant Edmund any harm," he said, to the room generally and to no one in particular, only to Julian. Only ever to make certain the estate had one steady hand on it. And I told myself, God forgive me, I told myself so many times that I came to half believe it, that I would manage it better than either of you ever could, and that the harm, if there was harm, would be small and private and would mend. He did not ask forgiveness. He asked only, quietly, to be allowed to go abroad rather than stand trial, for his mother's sake, an old woman in Bath who had buried one son already and need not bury the good name of the other in open court. And Julian, after a long silence in which the whole room seemed to hold its breath along with him, said that he would allow it, on the condition that every acre sold and every shilling taken be returned in full before Gerald ever boarded a ship, which was, Eleanor thought, watching him, the first time in a year she had heard her husband set a term of his own and mean to hold it. Gerald left the room without another word, and the guests, after a silence no one quite knew how to end, began, in ones and twos, the low, murmuring business of leaving too, until the breakfast room stood empty of everyone but the family, and the ledger page still lying open on the white cloth, like something that had finally been allowed to finish speaking. Eleanor was in the stable yard at her father's farm, 3 counties off, mucking out a loose box in the flat gray light of a morning that had not yet decided to clear, when she heard a horse coming up the lane at a pace no sensible rider used on wet ground, and came to the gate with a pitchfork still in her hand to find Julian dismounting Corax badly, favoring his bad leg, having ridden the black horse further and faster in one morning than he had ridden anything in a year. He had come alone, without a groom, without the carriage, without, she noticed, his cane, left behind again, this time perhaps for good. He stood at the gate the way he had stood at the Alderley gate a fortnight before, one hand at his throat where the cord used to sit, and this time, before she could decide whether silence or speech was owed first, he reached inside his collar and drew it out, the horsehair ring, worn again against his skin, and he said, "I found it in the drawer 3 nights ago, and I have not taken it off since. And I am sorry, Eleanor. I am sorrier than any speech I have practiced on the road here can properly hold, for sending you away and calling it kindness, when it was only fear wearing kindness's coat." He told her the rest of it there at the gate, the whole breakfast room, Gerald's lunge and Gerald's tiredness, and the terms set and accepted. And he told her, too, the thing underneath all of it, that he had spent a year believing himself the author of his brother's death, and had let that belief make him small and manageable and grateful to anyone willing to manage him, and that learning it was a lie had not, as he had expected, simply lifted the weight away, but had left him furious in its place, furious at a year handed over to grief that was not even entirely his own, and that he did not know, standing here, which of those 2 feelings he was more afraid of. Eleanor set down the pitchfork. She said she would come back to Alderley, but that she would not come back to the year they had just lived through, that she would not be sent away again for her own good, without being asked first whether her own good was hers to decide, and that if he meant to ride again, truly ride, not just gallop a borrowed horse 3 counties in a single morning to prove a point, then he would do it with her beside him, and not as a thing managed quietly while she looked the other way. "Those are my terms," she said, "and I will not soften them for the sake of making this easier to hear." Julian said he would not ask her to soften a single one of them. He said it plainly, the way a man says a thing he has decided to mean for the rest of his life, rather than merely for the morning he is standing in. And then, because some things are easier shown than said, even between 2 people who have just said the hardest things either of them knew how to say, he took her hand and turned it over and pressed it, briefly, against Corax's warm black shoulder, the horse standing steady under both their hands, the way he had stood steady his whole life for anyone patient enough to earn it. They rode back to Alderley together, Juniper and Corax side by side up the long lane, and were married again, in a manner of speaking, 6 weeks later. A small, quiet second ceremony that Lady Augusta insisted upon, and that Eleanor privately thought was less for the county's benefit than for her own. An old woman's way of saying aloud,
in front of witnesses, that she had misjudged a horse breeder's daughter once, and did not mean to go on doing it. A year on from that morning at the gate, Eleanor Ashcombe stood again at the Alderley paddock in the grey hour before the kitchen fires were properly lit, and saddled 2 horses with her own hands, because she still trusted no one else's for a thing that mattered this much. Though this year she had help she had not had before. A boy not yet 2 years old propped on her hip, watching with the wide, unblinking seriousness small children give to anything large and warm-breathing. One fat fist already reaching for the cord at his mother's throat. Julian came out into the yard dressed to ride, properly this time, no hesitation in it, and took the boy from her so she could finish the girth strap, checking it himself, twice, out of a habit he had never fully set down since Sedgemoor, and never intended to. The copper rider on the stable roof turned its slow quarter turn in a wind that smelled this year only of ordinary autumn, wood smoke and turned earth, and nothing underneath it waiting to be found. Julian slipped the horsehair ring from his own throat, worn soft now with a year of daily wearing, and looped it instead around the boy's small wrist, where it hung loose enough to slide off with the least tug, which was, Eleanor thought, watching him do it, exactly as it should be. A thing made rather than bought, handed on rather than kept locked away, meant from the start to be outgrown. Tam Rigg, watching the 3 of them from the stable door, with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been proven right about something he never once said aloud, observed only that the black horse still went quiet for a gait, same as he always had, and that some things in this life, thank God, a person needn't go and improve. They rode out together into the cold, clean morning, husband and wife, the boy handed up to ride the last stretch of paddock in his father's arms, before a nursemaid claimed him back. And Eleanor did not look back at the house, because for the first time in 2 years there was nothing behind her she needed watching, only the road ahead, and the frost not yet come, and the whole bright, ordinary day still deciding, gently now, and without anyone's fear attached to the deciding, what colour it meant to be.
And if this one sat with you a while by your own fire tonight, stay a little longer before you let it go out. Because it is the small, ordinary courage of a woman who would not stop saddling horses that carried this whole house through. And if the moment Julian slipped that worn little ring onto his son's wrist is the one still sitting with you, that is the moment worth telling someone else about. So go on and say so in a word or 2 below. And let channel name keep the kettle on for you, because there is always another tale waiting to be lit from these embers. So sleep gently tonight, and be kind to whoever you find beside you in the morning.